Imagine standing in the crowded square of a medieval Italian city, watching as executioners prepare their instruments of death, while thousands of spectators cheer for blood. But this isn't an ordinary execution. The condemned man is someone who should be untouchable. A cardinal of the Catholic Church, the son of the Pope himself, and one of the most feared political figures in Renaissance Europe. Yet here he stands, hands bound, watching his own brother's mutilated corpse being displayed as a warning, while knowing that in moments, he too will face the same brutal fate. His name was Cesare Borgia, and this is the extraordinary story of how the most powerful illegitimate son in Christian history rose to command armies, terrorize kingdoms, and inspire Machiavelli's The Prince, only to find himself betrayed, imprisoned, and forced to witness his own carefully orchestrated destruction at the hands of enemies who had waited years for their revenge. The story begins not in execution squares or battlefields, but in the shadowy corridors of Vatican power, where one of history's most corrupt and ambitious families was systematically destroying the moral authority of the Catholic Church in pursuit of temporal power and dynastic glory. Cesare Borgia was born in 1475, the illegitimate son of Cardinal Rodrigo Borgia, who would later become Pope Alexander VI, one of the most scandalous pontiffs in church history. His mother was Vanessa de Cat, a Roman noblewoman who served as the cardinal's long-term mistress and bore him several children during their relationship that lasted over a decade. Even by the standards of Renaissance Italy, where corruption and nepotism were commonplace, the Borgia family represented something unprecedented in their shameless combination of religious authority and secular ambition. Cardinal Rodrigo made no attempt to hide his relationship with Vanessa or his other mistresses, openly acknowledging his children and using church resources to advance their careers and political prospects. This was simply moral hypocrisy. It was a deliberate strategy to transform the papacy from a spiritual institution into a hereditary monarchy that could compete with the great royal dynasties of Europe. Cesare grew up in this atmosphere of unlimited ambition and moral flexibility, receiving the finest education available while being groomed for a role in his father's grand design for Borgia dominance. He was extraordinarily intelligent, physically impressive, and charismatically persuasive, possessing all the qualities necessary for success in Renaissance politics. But he was also raised without any meaningful moral constraints, taught that power justified any action and that family loyalty superseded all other obligations, including those to God, law, and human decency. When Rodrigo Borgia was elected Pope Alexander VI in 1492, through a combination of bribery, political manipulation, and outright simony, 17-year-old Cesare found himself in an unprecedented position as the acknowledged son of the most powerful religious figure in Christianity. The new pope immediately began using his spiritual authority to advance his family's temporal interests, appointing Cesare as a cardinal despite his youth and lack of religious vocation, and beginning the systematic corruption of church governance that would make the Borgias synonymous with papal scandal. But Cesare chafed under the restrictions of ecclesiastical life. Viewing his cardinal's hat as a stepping stone rather than a destination, his true interests lay in military command and political conquest, not in the ceremonies and theological disputes that characterized church leadership. He envied his younger brother, Juan, whom their father had appointed as captain general of the papal armies and Duke of Gandia, giving him the military career that Cesare desperately wanted for himself. This sibling rivalry would soon escalate into something far more dangerous and ultimately tragic. The first hint of the violence that would characterize Cesare's life came in 1497 when his brother Juan was found murdered in the Tiber River, his body bearing evidence of brutal torture and mutilation. While the official investigation blamed unknown assassins, rumors immediately began circulating that Cesare himself had ordered his brother's death out of jealousy and ambition. Whether or not he was directly responsible, Juan's convenient elimination cleared the way for Cesare to claim the military position he had always coveted. And Pope Alexander quickly appointed his surviving son as the new captain general of the church's armies. This appointment marked the beginning of Cesare's transformation from reluctant cardinal to Renaissance warlord. In 1498, he took the unprecedented step of renouncing his cardinalate, the first person in church history to voluntarily abandon such a high ecclesiastical office, and embarked on a military campaign to conquer central Italy for the Borgia family. His goal was nothing less than the creation of a new kingdom carved out of the papal states, with himself as its hereditary ruler and his father's spiritual authority as the foundation for temporal power. Cesare's military campaigns were characterized by a combination of tactical brilliance and shocking brutality that made him both feared and admired throughout Italy. He understood that, in the chaotic political landscape of Renaissance Italy, where city-states constantly shifted alliances and mercenary armies changed sides based on payment, only the most ruthless and unpredictable leaders could maintain power. He deliberately cultivated a reputation for extreme violence, not just defeating his enemies but destroying them so completely that others would submit rather than risk similar treatment. His conquest of the Romagna region demonstrated both his strategic genius and his complete abandonment of moral constraints. Rather than simply occupying territory and installing governors, Cesare systematically eliminated existing ruling families, confiscated their wealth, and established a reign of terror designed to prevent any possibility of rebellion or resistance. He understood that half measures in politics often led to total failure, and he was determined to create a foundation of power so solid that it could survive even the death of his papal father. The most infamous example of Cesare's methods occurred during his siege of Faenza in 1501, when he ordered the public execution of the city's entire ruling family, including children, to demonstrate that resistance to Borgia rule would result in complete annihilation. But even more shocking than the murders themselves was the theatrical way Cesare orchestrated them, forcing the surviving population to watch as their former rulers were tortured and killed, then requiring them to cheer and celebrate their new Borgia overlord. This was unjust military conquest. It was psychological warfare designed to break the spirit of resistance before it could form. These tactics earned Cesare the admiration of Machiavelli, who served as a diplomatic observer during many of the Borgia campaigns and later used Cesare as the primary inspiration for his masterwork, The Prince. Machiavelli saw in Cesare the perfect example of how effective leadership required the abandonment of conventional morality in favor of pragmatic calculation. He wrote that Cesare possessed the rare combination of lion-like strength and fox-like cunning that allowed him to succeed where more traditionally virtuous rulers had failed. But Cesare's success depended entirely on his father's continued hold on papal power and the resources of the Catholic Church. Pope Alexander VI provided not just financial support for his son's campaigns, but also the religious justification that allowed them to claim divine sanction for what were essentially wars of conquest and personal enrichment. The Pope regularly issued papal bulls declaring Cesare's enemies to be enemies of God, excommunicating rulers who resisted Borgia expansion, and using spiritual weapons to support temporal ambitions. This dependence on papal support created an inherent vulnerability that Cesare seemed unable or unwilling to acknowledge. His entire power structure was built on the foundation of his father's position, and he made no serious effort to create independent sources of authority or legitimacy that could survive Alexander's death. Instead, he continued to expand his territories and increase his enemies, apparently believing that his military success and reputation for ruthlessness would be sufficient to maintain his position, regardless of changes in papal politics. The crisis that would ultimately destroy Cesare came in August 1503, when Pope Alexander VI suddenly fell ill and died, possibly from poison intended for his enemies, but accidentally consumed by himself. Within hours of his father's death, Cesare found himself in an impossibly vulnerable position. His armies were scattered across Italy, his treasury was depleted from constant warfare, and his numerous enemies immediately began plotting their revenge against the man who had terrorized them for years. The College of Cardinals, freed from Borgia influence, quickly elected Pius III as the new pope, and when he died after just 26 days in office, they chose Giuliano della Rovere as Julius II. Della Rovere had been one of Caesar's most implacable enemies, driven into exile during the Borgia papacy and burning with desire for revenge against the family that had humiliated him. His election as pope marked the beginning of a systematic campaign to destroy everything Cesare had built and to exact brutal vengeance for years of Borgia excesses. Cesare initially attempted to maintain his position through negotiation and political maneuvering, offering to support the new pope in exchange for confirmation of his territorial conquests and military positions. But Julius II had no intention of allowing his enemy to retain any power or influence. Instead, he began systematically stripping Cesare of his titles, confiscating his properties, and encouraging his enemies throughout Italy to rise against him. Within months, the vast Borgia Empire that had taken years to construct was collapsing as former subjects and allies abandoned the suddenly powerless Cesare. Desperate to salvage something from the wreckage of his ambitions, Cesare fled to Naples, where he hoped to find protection from the Spanish crown that had supported some of his earlier campaigns. But even his foreign allies proved unwilling to risk papal displeasure by harboring such a notorious fugitive. Instead of offering sanctuary, the Spanish authorities arrested Cesare and transported him to Spain as a prisoner, officially to face charges related to his military campaigns, but actually to remove him permanently from Italian politics. The Spanish imprisonment marked the beginning of a new phase in Cesare's downfall, as he found himself confined in increasingly harsh conditions, while his enemies consolidated their victory and began planning their final revenge. He was initially held in relatively comfortable circumstances, treated as a political prisoner of some importance, but as months turned to years and his former power became merely a memory, his treatment became progressively worse. His captors understood that he retained considerable charisma and political skill, making him dangerous even in prison if he were allowed contact with potential supporters or allies. The psychological impact of this imprisonment was devastating for someone who had spent his adult life wielding absolute power over life and death. Cesare, who had once commanded armies and terrorized kingdoms, found himself reduced to begging guards for basic necessities and depending entirely on the whims of jailers, who took pleasure in humiliating their famous prisoner. The man who had ordered the execution of entire families now experienced the helplessness and terror that he had inflicted on countless others. But Caesar's enemies were not content with simple imprisonment or even eventual execution. They wanted something more elaborate and psychologically devastating. A public spectacle that would demonstrate the complete destruction of Borgia power and serve as a warning to other ambitious families who might attempt similar challenges to established authority. They began planning an execution that would be as theatrical and symbolic as it was brutal, designed to strip away not just Caesar's life, but his dignity, reputation, and any possibility of martyrdom or heroic legacy. The plan they developed was diabolical in its psychological sophistication. Rather than simply executing Cesare, they would force him to witness the systematic destruction of everything he had cared about, beginning with his remaining family members and closest associates. His brother Geoffrey was captured and tortured to death, with detailed accounts of his suffering being provided to Cesare to maximize his psychological anguish. His former lieutenants and supporters were hunted down and executed, often in deliberately brutal ways designed to demonstrate what happened to those who had served the Borgia cause. Most cruelly of all, Cesare was forced to watch as his own son, Giovanni Borgia, was arrested and publicly executed as a demonstration of the complete extinction of the Borgia bloodline. The boy, who was barely 15 years old and had played no role in his father's political machinations, was tortured and killed specifically to cause maximum psychological damage to The execution was conducted in full view of Cesare's prison window, ensuring that he could see every detail of his child's suffering, while being powerless to intervene or even comfort him. These preliminary executions served not just as revenge, but as psychological preparation for Caesare's own death. breaking down his mental defenses and reducing him from a proud and defiant prisoner to a broken man who understood the full extent of his defeat. His captors reported that he aged visibly during these months, his famous charisma and commanding presence dissolving into something approaching madness as he was forced to confront the consequences of his own ruthlessness reflected back upon his family. The final phase of Cesare's destruction began in early 1507, when he was transported back to Italy for public execution. The journey itself was designed as a humiliation, with Caesar, displayed in chains as a conquered enemy, being paraded through the same cities he had once ruled as a victorious general. Former subjects who had trembled at his name now felt safe to throw stones and curses at the fallen tyrant, while the authorities encouraged these displays of contempt as part of the psychological warfare being conducted against their prisoner. The execution itself was scheduled to take place in the central square of Vienna, a Spanish city where Cesare's downfall could be witnessed by thousands of spectators and serve as a definitive end to the Borgia threat. But even more psychologically devastating than the prospect of his own death was the requirement that he first watches the bodies of his already executed family, their remains mutilated and burned, while he was forced to observe from the scaffold that would soon claim his own life. The scene that greeted Cesare as he was led to his execution was carefully orchestrated to maximize his psychological torment. The square was packed with thousands of spectators who had come to witness the death of one of the most feared men in Europe, many of them survivors of his military campaigns or relatives of his victims. The executioners had prepared their instruments with theatrical precision, displaying axes, swords, and torture devices that would be used to ensure that his death would be as prolonged and painful as possible. But perhaps the most devastating aspect of the entire spectacle was the presence of his enemies among the official witnesses, including representatives of every family he had destroyed and every ruler he had humiliated during his years of power. These men had waited years for this moment, and they intended to savor every detail of his suffering as payment for the terror he had inflicted upon them and their loved ones. As Cesare stood on the scaffold, looking out over the crowd that had gathered to celebrate his death, he must have understood that this was the inevitable conclusion of the path he had chosen decades earlier. His pursuit of absolute power, his abandonment of moral constraints, and his willingness to destroy anyone who opposed him had created a network of enemies so extensive and so committed to his destruction that his downfall had become mathematically inevitable once his father's protection was removed. The execution itself was conducted with deliberate ceremony and maximum brutality, designed not just to end Cesare's life, but to obliterate any possibility that he might be remembered as a heroic figure or tragic victim. He was tortured before the final blow, forced to confess his crimes publicly, and required to acknowledge the justice of his punishment before the assembled crowd. Even in death, he was denied the dignity of defiance or the consolation of martyrdom. But history would prove that Caesar's enemies, despite their complete victory in the moment of his execution, could not control his ultimate legacy. His reputation as a brilliant and ruthless political operator would survive his ignominious death, inspiring not just Machiavelli's theoretical work, but centuries of political figures who saw in his methods a template for effective leadership unencumbered by conventional morality. The man who died in chains and humiliation would be remembered as one of the most successful practitioners of realpolitik in European history. The broader implications of Cesare Borgia's rise and fall extended far beyond his personal fate to influence the development of political theory, the reform of the Catholic Church, and the evolution of Renaissance statecraft. His career demonstrated both the possibilities and the dangers of combining religious authority with temporal ambition, showing how spiritual institutions could be corrupted by secular goals, while also revealing the ultimate futility of power structures built on pure force and intimidation. His relationship with his papal father also illustrated the complex dynamics of nepotism and family loyalty. In an era where personal relationships often determined political outcomes, the Borgia's attempt to create a hereditary papal monarchy failed not because it was immoral, Morality played little role in Renaissance politics, but because it was ultimately unsustainable without the institutional support that legitimate dynasties could command. Perhaps most significantly, Cesare's story serves as a case study in the dangers of building power structures that depend entirely on individual charisma and force, rather than institutional legitimacy and popular support. His remarkable military and political successes during his father's lifetime proved meaningless when the foundation of papal protection was removed, demonstrating that even the most brilliant and ruthless leaders are vulnerable if they fail to create sustainable sources of authority. The psychological dimensions of Cesare's story also provide insights into the personal costs of pursuing absolute power without moral constraints. His willingness to eliminate family members, torture enemies, and terrorize populations in pursuit of his ambitions ultimately created the network of hatred and desire for revenge that made his own destruction inevitable. The man who showed no mercy to others found none when his own moment of vulnerability arrived. Modern historians continue to debate whether Cesare Borgia should be remembered primarily as a brilliant political innovator who anticipated modern concepts of statecraft, or as a cautionary example of how the pursuit of power without ethical limitations ultimately leads to self-destruction. His influence on political theory through Machiavelli ensures his continued relevance to discussions about leadership, morality, and the relationship between effectiveness and virtue in governance. His execution, witnessed by thousands and documented by multiple contemporary observers, marked not just the end of an individual life, but the conclusion of one of the most ambitious and ultimately unsuccessful attempts to reshape the political landscape of Renaissance Europe. The Pope's son, who had once seemed destined to found a new dynasty, died as a prisoner, an enemy of the very institution that had given birth to his ambitions. If this story of ambition, corruption, and the ultimate price of absolute power has moved you, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. What aspect of Cesare Borgia's rise and fall do you find most compelling? His transformation from cardinal to warlord, his brilliant but brutal military campaigns, or the psychological warfare conducted by his enemies during his final imprisonment and execution? And if you're interested in more stories about how the pursuit of unlimited power corrupts even the most capable individuals, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell, because history is filled with figures whose extraordinary abilities were ultimately destroyed by their moral choices, and whose stories continue to offer lessons about the relationship between ambition, ethics, and political survival. Thank you for joining me in exploring this dark chapter in the history of papal politics and Renaissance warfare.